I wanted to work through a couple of examples from the back of that notes page for you. So on this one, we are looking at our basic graph, sorry, our tangent, which if you look back at your basic graph for tangent, recall that it started at 0, went up, then ran into an asymptote, and then when we did it, went backwards to make our next asymptote. So this one, no matter what, should start at whatever that midline is. Your 1/4 is kind of like your amplitude, so instead of these dots being at 1 and -1, they're going to be at 1/4. So if you want to think of that as your amplitude, you can, but again, it is not technically called that. In order to mark the 1/4, I'm going to make the top one and the bottom -1. That way each hash mark is actually counting by 1/4. This section, just like when we did sine and cosine, is actually shifting our graphs either to left or right. So to figure out what it's doing, we need to set up our equations. So typically, when graphing, and for all of them, your starting point, you always are going to start at 0 for your theta. So it starts at 0, so it's set equal to 0. For tangent, since the period is just pi, my ending is actually at pi instead of 2 pi. So I'm going to solve these. So I'd add pi over 2 to both sides, so I should start here. 1 pi plus a half pi is 1½ or 3 pi over 2. So my first period is going to end there. Remember, tangent started at the center, so I actually am starting at 0. I'm going to go up to the right, down to the left. I have my asymptotes around that. I would say once you figure out where an asymptote is, it's kind of nice to just go ahead and place all of those. They should be pi distance apart, unless your period's been changed. But since I'm going from 1/2 to 1½, my period is still pi. Also, there's no number in front of your x there. So I have my graph like that. Make sure you keep repeating it. Since again, this is my technical ending point, officially, my first period is from this spot over to this spot. But that just looks very awkward with tangent. That's why I kind of started and then go backwards. The other one I wanted to do was number 4 with our cosecant. So this number here is, again, like your amplitude, except for that it's not truly an amplitude, it's not a maximum or a minimum. Cosecant, if you recall, started at an asymptote, ended at an asymptote, had asymptotes in the middle, and then those like parabolas happening. These are now happening at 3 and -3. It's not been shifted or stretched or anything like that horizontally. So I can start with my asymptote, end with my asymptote, and then asymptote in the middle. Now, since my amplitude, again, if you will, is 3, I need to come all the way up to 3 and down to -3 for those points that I'm curling off of. I would repeat the same thing going backwards. So hopefully that helps a little with all of these. Look back at your original notes page to decide whether they start with an asymptote like this one did, or on the tangent where it started with that 0 spot, so you know where to go. It still follows the same rules of the numbers out front being your amplitude, if you will. Again, they're not technically amplitudes, they're not maximums and minimums, but it's treated the same, and anything inside the function is moving it left and right or maybe stretching it.